Broadcasting from New York City to the world, it's the G-Man Interviews.
I think the federal war on drugs is a total failure. You can at least let sick people have marijuana because it's helpful, but compassionate conservatives say, well, we can't do this. We're going to put people who are sick and dying with cancer, and they're being helped with marijuana if they have multiple sclerosis. The federal government's going in there and overriding state laws and putting people like that in prison. Why don't we handle the drugs like we had alcohol? Alcohol's a deadly drug. What about the real deadly drugs are the prescription drugs? They kill a lot more people than the illegal drugs. So the drug war is out of control. I fear the drug war because it undermines our civil liberties. It magnifies our problems on the borders. We spend, like, over the last 40 years, $1 trillion on this war. And believe me, the kids can still get the drugs. It just hasn't worked.
Welcome. My guest is Dr. Stephen Jonas, Senior Editor, Politics for the Greanville Post. He is a Professor Emeritus of Preventive Medicine at Stony Brook University in New York, and author, co-author, editor, and co-editor of over 30 books. In addition to his role with the Greanville Post, he is a contributor for American politics to the Planetary Movement, a columnist for BuzzFlash Truthout, an author for OpEdNews, and the editorial director of and a contributing author to the Political Junkies for Progressive Democracy. Dr. Jonas's latest book is The 15% Solution: How the Republican Religious Right Took Control of the U.S. 1981 to 2022, a futuristic novel. Dr. Jonas appeared on this show in 2013 to discuss the pros and cons of the Affordable Care Act, commonly referred to as Obamacare, and he has written extensively about America's war on drugs for over 20 years. He joins me to discuss his recent and revealing two-part column, Let's Hear It for Prohibition, an interim way out of the drug war mess. It's a pleasure to welcome you back to the show, Dr. Jonas.
Thank you so much. Delighted to be here. Delighted to be here. Thank you.
Links to part 1 and 2 of your column will be posted in the YouTube description area of this episode for those interested in reading them. That being the case, could you mention one of the key points presented in part 1 and why it's so critically important in terms of understanding the so-called war on drugs in America?
Well, there's several key points. The first is that the war on drugs is an artificial creation that really had nothing to do with drugs, because if we were really concerned with drugs and what I call the recreational mood-altering drugs, we would be focused first on tobacco and alcohol, because they're the killers. Tobacco, fortunately, smoking has declined very rapidly in the United States, but because of the hangover of the use of tobacco products, we still have 440,000 to 500,000 deaths a year. Alcohol, depending upon how you count, it's between 60,000 and 100,000. From the late 19th century to the mid-teens of the last century, 15 states in this country actually tried tobacco prohibition. Then, of course, we had the famous prohibition for alcohol between 1920 and 1933. That program was considered to be a failure. It created a great deal of organized crime. But what should be noted about prohibition, capital P, in comparison to the so-called drug war, is that prohibition achieved a reduction, a very significant reduction in the use of alcoholic products in the United States. And that's because it covered both hard liquor, spirits, and beer. Beer is big. It certainly was in those days. I mean, there weren't the small breweries. They didn't exist. There were very large breweries. But beer is big because it takes a lot of space to make it, and beer is big because you have to drink a lot of beer to get drunk or pleasantly high or whatever. The use of beer dropped to almost nil. The use of spirits didn't change much at all because of the very successful importation of spirits with such importers as Joseph Kennedy. Now, the idea of the drug war was picking out 3 particular drugs, all of them being much less harmful than tobacco or alcohol. And I'm not the only person who studied this who has come to the conclusion that the drug war had very little to do with drugs, and it particularly had to do with which segment of the drug-using population it was aimed at, which of course is the non-white segment of the population, particularly African Americans. While we can say that in terms of reducing alcohol use, prohibition was successful, reduced alcohol use by about half. In the 40 years, 45 years of the drug war, there has been virtually no change in the use of the three major substances against which the drug war is used, namely marijuana, heroin, and cocaine. I mean, marijuana grows anywhere. It's a weed. That's why it's called weed, interestingly enough, because it is, okay? Cocaine grows very easily. It's grown in tens of thousands of acres in Latin America. Heroin is actually used by very few people, several hundred, maybe 600,000 in the United States. And the problem with heroin is much more related to how it is forced to be used, that is with non-sterile needles, than with the heroin itself. So what we have to look at is an institution that has completely failed in terms of its supposed objective. And these are data from the National Institute of Mental Health, from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration. These are not made-up data. These data are published every year, and it shows very little use. The propaganda from the proponents of the drug war is that if you make any of these substances legal, the use will skyrocket. That has not happened in such places as Alaska, where it was legalized for a few years back in the 1980s and 90s. Has not changed in Portugal, where it's been used, it's been legal since 2001. And there's a most interesting piece of data, current data, from the state of Colorado. The prediction was that the state of Colorado would collect $62 million in taxes in the first year of the legal sale of marijuana. The state of Colorado has collected $55 million in taxes.
But it's heading there.
So it didn't, explode.
In part 2 of your column, you made the case, and quite strongly, that the war on drugs is responsible for creating the prison industrial complex.
Yes.
How so?
It's because the war on drugs, I'm one of the few people who compares what's happened in the war on drugs to what happened in the Prohibition. The war on drugs made possession and use of the named substances a crime, as well as making the distribution and sale a crime. Prohibition made only importation, distribution, and sale a crime. A police raid on a speakeasy, what happened to the patrons of the speakeasy? Of course, they were almost invariably all white. They were sent home. And there was the traffickers, and of course, all the law enforcement efforts against the traffickers didn't work anyway. They kept getting around them. But that's the difference. It made possession and use a crime. And obviously, that is a law that is aimed at users. And the supposition was that if you make possession and use a crime, that you will reduce the use because of the fear of getting caught. That did not happen. And we knew in the first 10, 15 years that it did not happen. But of course, the war continued to be prosecuted. And we know that the prisons and jails, and you've done shows on it, are overwhelmingly filled with African American, to a certain extent, Latino prisoners. 75%, approximately 75% of the persons in prison or jail for drug-related offenses are not white, and approximately 75% of the users of the same substances are white. So there's no conclusion that you can draw other than this is a racist enterprise. And the promoters of the drug war will not discuss it. They will only discuss how bad the drugs are for you, and we've got to have the drug war to prevent all these bad outcomes. First of all, the drug war does nothing to prevent the use of these drugs, and we know from the experiences with legalization of marijuana anyway, that it doesn't change. Second of all, what I like to say is, I am not promoting the use of marijuana, heroin, or cocaine, and they all can have negative consequences. One of the tragedies of the war on drugs as far as marijuana is concerned is that because of the war on drugs, the marijuana that is sold illegally has become much more concentrated, and therefore it's potentially much more harmful. But if you're looking at drugs that create negative outcomes, let's start with tobacco and alcohol. I have a number of disagreements with the drug policy reform movement, as well as I have disagreements with the drug warriors. My principal disagreement with the drug policy reform movement is that they refuse to make any links between marijuana, heroin, and cocaine and tobacco and alcohol. They will not bring the use of those drugs into the discussion. And when I was active with these folks in the late 80s and early 90s, when I did most of my publishing, including, as you probably are aware, 2 articles that appeared in law reviews on drug policy reform, I continually attempted to say, hey, come on, guys, we got to start talking about tobacco and alcohol and link our concerns with these 2 much more dangerous drugs. None of the leaders, including Ethan Nadelman, he's the big front man for the anti-war on drug movement, they refuse to talk to me about this.
Why?
I have no idea why, but they just said, we're not interested. I mean, they actually said, I mean, I remember I was at one meeting and the board of directors of the group that we had then was getting together, and I asked, could I attend? I mean, I was a speaker every year, and could I attend the board meeting? And the man who I forget his name now, who was the head of the organization then, said, oh, you want to come and talk to us about tobacco and alcohol, right? And I said, yeah, that's right. He said, well, we're not interested. And the drug policy reform movement has increasingly focused on marijuana legalization. That's not what my interest is. That would be a side effect of ending the drug war. My interest is in ending the drug war because of its totally negative effects on our society as a whole. My interest in ending the drug war is that we would then be able to have a comprehensive program to deal with drug use in the United States and the use of what I call the recreational and mood-altering drugs. And ending the drug war would have a variety of positive effects. One is it would empty the prisons of a lot of people who don't belong there, because why are they there? They committed the non-violent crimes of possession and use, which are simply crimes by definition. They are crimes by definition. There's nothing in either possession or use that hurts anybody else. The use of those laws has been focused on a particular sector of the population, which is consistent with the racist history in this country. With tobacco, we have an example of a very successful public health approach to the most lethal killer drug that we use in the United States. With the opposition of the tobacco companies until the late 1990s, from the time of the release of the original Surgeon General's report on smoking and health in 1964, when the proportion of the adult population smoking cigarettes was around 45%. Now it's around 20%. This has been enormously successful. It's a combination of education, of advertising, of limiting the places of use, which has come in only in the last 10 to 15 years, and taxation policy. And we are saving the lives down the road of hundreds of thousands of people without using the criminal law, without locking up smokers. I mean, can you imagine? There's no difference between taking somebody who smokes cigarettes and locking them up and taking somebody who smokes marijuana or injects heroin or snorts cocaine and locking them up. Tell me what the difference is. There is none. We don't do that. The evidence is there of what the real purpose of the drug war is, and it has nothing to do with the use of drugs or trying to reduce it. Ending the drug war would enable us to have a comprehensive public health program for dealing with all of the recreation and mood-altering drugs, which would use the same kinds of interventions that we've used for tobacco. One of the problems in dealing with the alcohol industry is how dependent they are on advertising. We were able to ban cigarette advertising on television. They knew what their problems were going to be, and they wanted to try to diminish them. It's fascinating. Once the suits started against tobacco in the late 1990s, there was discovery. And I thought that they would have been smart enough to destroy all of their paper records. The tobacco industry knew in the 1950s how harmful their product was for health. There were memos.
1950s.
Yeah. The knowledge, very interestingly, was first developed by German scientists in the Nazi period. Hitler did very, very few good things. But because in the 1930s, German scientists came to the conclusion that tobacco was bad for your health, and the Nazis started the world's first national anti-smoking program.
The Nazis.
The Nazis, yes. It was aimed at everybody except the members of the armed forces. And one thing they were particularly interested in was the effect of smoking on pregnant women, because, of course, they were interested in producing as many children to grow up to be Nazis as they possibly.
The master race.
Yeah, the master race.
Given everything you studied and written about on this subject, are you convinced that the creation of the prison industrial complex was the sole objective when the war on drugs was implemented?
No. I can't look into the minds of Richard Nixon and the people around him. I can't read their minds. It certainly was part of Nixon's Southern strategy of becoming the party of white racism. It was certainly part of that. Whether they contemplated the development of the private prison system, just how many hundreds of thousands of black people would be essentially deprived not only of their freedom but their citizenship, I really don't know. But I will tell you this. In 1973, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration was about to release a comprehensive study of the use of marijuana, and they had come to the conclusion that it had very few harmful effects and that criminalizing its use was much worse than allowing it to be sold legally. And that was suppressed by the Nixon administration. People knew about it. I knew about it at the time. And then I certainly became more familiar with it when I got active in the drug policy reform movement starting in the late 1980s. But it was never allowed to be official government policy because they had embarked on the drug war. And of course, the drug war has always been an apartheid enterprise. In the early 1990s, again, I was very active at that time, went to a national meeting, which was attended by Joe Biden, who was the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee at the time. And he was a very strong supporter. You could not discuss the matter with him. I remember sitting down with Jay Rockefeller and discussing the matter with him. And he sort of nodded and smiled. But any Democrat who would have wanted to do something about the drug war would have immediately been labeled a commie by the Republicans. And I think that's still part of the problem. I can't delve into the minds, but the point is that's what happened. Whether it was an intended consequence or an unintended consequence, I have no idea. But it was a consequence, and that's what we have to deal with.
In her groundbreaking book, Michelle Alexander describes many of the situations you present as the new Jim Crow.
Yes.
Which happens to be the title of her book.
Yes, it is. Yes.
Do you agree with her assessment of mass incarceration in the United States?
Absolutely.
How exactly would prohibition transform what you call the drug war mess?
In this two-part series of articles which you cite, I came up with an idea. I mean, I've been working in this area for almost 30 years, and it never occurred to me before. It's an interim solution.
Interim solution.
It's an interim solution. It would solve the problem of mass incarceration. it would not solve the problem of the continuation of the drug war, of all the negative effects that the drug war has on the communities, on the creation of crime, on the tens of thousands of deaths in Mexico and other Latin American countries. It would not solve that problem. But you could significantly reduce the number of people in jail and prison for drug-related offenses for possession and use by simply making the law just like the law was under Prohibition. And that is that importation, distribution, and sale are crimes, possession and use are not. And I don't think anybody else has said that. To me, it's an interim solution. I think we have to end the criminalization of the distribution, sale, possession, and use of certain drugs. We are now at the point where Vicodin and OxyContin, the drugs themselves aren't illegal. What's illegal is the use of the drugs on a non-prescription basis. But the use of those drugs is much more widespread than, for example, the use of heroin. We're not rounding up people who use Vicodin and OxyContin and throwing them into jail and prison. No, I'm sure it's just coincidental that the bulk of those people happen to be white. Just coincidental. And we're not rounding up tens of thousands of users of meth and throwing them in jail because it must be just coincidental that the nickname for meth is the white heroin. We're talking about racism here, Gary. I mean, it's just plain and simple.
The Citizens United ruling and organizations like the American Legislative Exchange Council, also known as ALEC, and the Corrections Corporation of America, CCA, have dramatically transformed our political and prison system. If various groups at the grassroots level started popping up across the country and demanding that new legislation be drafted calling for prohibition, as you suggest, is it likely that many lawmakers would dismiss them because of their financial allegiances or political associations with ALEC or the CCA? In other words, and with all due respect, isn't the idea of prohibition wishful thinking, more or less?
The idea of redefining the crimes so that they corresponded to what they were under Prohibition with a capital P. Yeah, I mean, right now, I think any of these proposals is wishful thinking, except for, the marijuana legalization is proceeding across the country. And I'm all in favor of marijuana legalization, mind you. But it doesn't solve, I'm looking at this, Gary, from the perspective of the public health physician, which is what I've been all my life. It does not solve the drug use problem and the problems that arise from the use of the recreational mood-altering drugs. That's what I am particularly interested in. I don't want to prohibit use. I would like to reduce it. I would like to bring it under control. I would like people to know more about what the harmful effects are. And, of course, in what I call the public health approach to the drug problem, a major emphasis of that is on the use of tobacco and alcohol by children, because that's where lifelong drug abuse starts. Most people don't become smokers or problem drinkers starting as adults. They start as children. And virtually nobody uses marijuana, particularly heroin and cocaine, as their first drug of choice. What I like about my idea is that it would not end the drug war. In other words, it's something both sides can like. It would end mass incarceration, but the drug war against importation, trade, and sale wouldn't end. So that the more enlightened drug warriors, this is something more enlightened. I mean, there got to be a few enlightened people on that side. This is something they could line up behind. The pressure against it would be enormous. It's well known that the private prisons are big contributors. We know that and I talk about this at the end of the second article, we know that when marijuana legalization was a proposition in California for voting, that the prison guards contributed money to the opponents of marijuana legalization. This is a serious problem. We would have to provide alternative jobs for a lot of people who work in the prison industry. And we would have to deal with what would happen to lots of rural communities like Dannemora, that are next to prisons if they were emptied out of their nonviolent drug users. This country is not good at mass planning.
So we bring this episode to a close. Could you provide some information on your upcoming book?
Yes, it's called Ending the Drug War, Solving the Drug Problem. And it goes over a lot of the material that we've talked about in this interview. And the primary conclusion of this book is, if we want to solve the drug problem, and we're doing a very good job of it with tobacco, we have to have a comprehensive public health approach. And the last chapter of the book is the public health approach. I wrote the standard chapter in the standard textbook on this whole area, which is called substance abuse. I've written a chapter on the public health approach to the drug problem. Such a chapter was first included in that book over 20 years ago. What I say is, tobacco products, what comes along with tobacco products, they're dangerous. Alcohol is a special problem to deal with from a public health perspective because most people who use alcoholic substances, like you and me, we don't get into trouble with them. We'll have a cocktail before dinner, once or twice a week when we go out. We'll have a glass of wine. The vast majority of people that use alcohol, they don't get into trouble with it at all. On the other hand, 50% of murders in the United States are associated with alcohol use, either by the perpetrator or by the victim or both. I'm not arguing that marijuana is a harmless drug. I don't have to. And most cocaine users are what are called chippers. They use it on the weekends and they don't get into long-term trouble. If you're a long-term coke user and you're addicted to coke, yes, you certainly can get into trouble. The same thing can happen with heroin. The point is that I am not for the use of any recreational mood-altering drug. And of course, we do also now have to deal with Vicodin and Oxycontin, the prescription narcotics.
As well as the ones that are just popping up on the market like Molly and a host of others that a lot of the young kids are turning on to.
Yeah, right. So that's what this book is about, that we are not going to be able to move to have a comprehensive public health approach to the very broad-based drug problem in the United States unless we have legalization so that we treat all the substances the same. And one of the aspects of this that we haven't talked about is that in the United States we have a drug culture. If you have a problem, take a pill, and it starts with the kids. It starts with chewable, flavored vitamins to be given to 4 and 5-year-olds.
Okay. On that point, let me say this. We were growing up, we took the same things. We didn't end up getting hooked on anything.
No.
So what's the difference?
And most people don't.
Right.
Okay? But we live in a culture that encourages the dependence on, if you have a problem, take a pill. And that's going to increase the proportion of the population that says, okay, the pills, whatever it is, aspirin, Motrin, vitamins, they're not doing the trick. Let me try something else.
It was great having you back on the show, Dr. Jonas. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me, Gary. It's a pleasure. Anytime.
I'm the G-Man. And until next time, stay cool, stay safe, and stay informed.